Welcome to Financial Launchpad, a podcast designed to teach you about personal finance by starting with the basics and progressing to more complicated topics. We'll tackle a new topic every week and provide additional resources to learn even more and action items to launch your personal finance journey. I'm your host, Emily, and thank you for joining me as I discuss savings and emergency funds. So last week, during our first episode, we discussed budgeting, and I am sure that you're all pros by now at budgeting. Just kidding. It takes a really long time, but hopefully all of you are on the path to starting to track your spending and being more mindful of your purchases. So really, budgeting is a foundational piece of personal finance, and so is emergency funds and savings funds. So that's where we're going now. So according to a study by the Federal Reserve in June of 2018, about 40% of Americans said that they could not cover a $400 unexpected expense in cash, savings, or a credit card that was paid off the following month. So think about that. A $400 purchase, which it's so easy to do, whether that's an emergency pet visit or car maintenance or just new tires or who knows what. It's really not that much. So they couldn't cover it with cash or savings, and that is just really precarious to me. This sort of statistic is why I started this podcast, because it's just a really uncomfortable situation to be in, and there are ways to avoid it. So I'm going to start off by talking about emergency funds and why you need one, about how much you should have, and a lot of the resources that I provide expand on emergency funds. So we're just going to touch on them. So a general consensus is to have an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses, possibly more depending on your situation, and that is what to work toward eventually. There are things to do before you really build that 3 to 6 month emergency fund, and we'll get to that a little bit more later. So I want to touch on what is an emergency. You know, we talked a little bit last week about those sinking funds in budgeting, such as car maintenance and Christmas and vacations and all of that, and building up those funds over a long period of time and just progressively saving for them. So for me, an actual emergency tends to be a job loss, so you have loss of income, a medical emergency, some sort of family emergency that requires travel, and potentially house and car repairs if it's really that catastrophic. I challenge you to limit your definition of an emergency, though, once you have a better handle on your finances. When you're short on cash, everything can seem like an emergency. But should a car repair really be an emergency? It may be more than you were expecting, but we know that our cars are going to need repairs and general maintenance. It's a perfect example of a sinking fund that you should be funding monthly, like I was saying. House repair is a similar situation. If you know your air conditioner is near the end of its life, start saving for a new one. They are expensive. Even if everything seems all right, you should still have a sinking fund for house repairs if you own a home. From personal experience, we found out very quickly that there always seems to be something in need of repair or maintenance in a home. And that is also another reason to possibly consider renting for a little bit longer. So along with your emergency fund, I would also encourage you to consider having insurance deductibles set aside for your car, home, and anything else you may have for insurance. You know, like I think for our house, we have $1,000 deductible, and I have that kind of mentally set aside and, untouchable in our YNAB category. So for us, these sit with our sinking funds separate from our emergency fund. Once you're in a good financial position, you may even look at increasing those deductibles, but we'll talk about the pros and cons of that in a later episode. So when I talk about emergency funds being 3 to 6 months, that can seem like a gigantic amount for some people. You may not even be able to hold $500 in your account regularly. So the idea of having 3 to 6 months of expenses just seems daunting. So I don't want you to get too hung up on how much to save. The important part right now is to get your budget in order and start socking cash away. You may have debt that you're paying off, which we'll get to in the next episode. In that case, you may not want to work toward the fully funded 3 to 6 month emergency fund and just work on getting $1,000 cash or perhaps a full month's expenses buffer. When you have a buffer, you have likely broken the paycheck to paycheck cycle and you no longer have to time bills. A buffer is when every dollar that you earn this month goes to fund next month. So essentially you have a 1 month buffer and 1 month of expenses ready to go. So when a new month starts, all your categories are funded, and this can be a huge stress relief in and of itself. So try to work on establishing even a small emergency fund, especially if you have debt to pay off, just to really guard yourself against some of those unexpected things. Moving on from focusing on specifically emergency funds to also getting into just general saving, I want to clarify something that I struggle with as I am reading about things, learning about things. To me, it seems like the word invest and the word save are used interchangeably. And one of my focuses on this podcast is going to be trying to differentiate between those two. So an example of this is that a common piece of wisdom is to save 15% of your income for retirement. But what they really mean is invest. I mean, you can't just save it and put it in a savings fund because that doesn't work. So what I want to focus on is when I say save, that means something along the lines of a shorter term goal, something that you keep more liquid, versus investing. So investing means that you have put it in an IRA or it's, within the stock market and doing other things and you don't really want to touch that money. So that's the difference between saving and investing. And in this episode, we are focusing on savings. Savings accounts are for short-term goals and things that you want to complete in less than 5 years. It's money that you're going to need in 5 years or fewer. And examples of these might be saving up for a wedding. It could be a big vacation. It could be a down payment on a house. It could be for a car. That's one of the things that we're saving up for right now in a couple of years is a new car. So those are perfect examples of money that's money you're going to need in a relatively short amount of time. And you don't want to invest that necessarily because although investments are great for the long term, mostly meaning greater than 5 years, you're talking retirement funds and such, they're not good for short term. Because if you look at the overall trends of the stock market over a long period of time, you'll see that the general trend is up. It's increasing. That's why people invest in the stock market and people invest their money for retirement, is that the general trend of it is up and you're likely going to eventually make money. But if you look at it at a closer level, over the span of a few years, we can see fairly significant drops. It generally recovers, but you're trying to avoid that 5-year time span where it's likely impossible that the stock market's going to decrease at some point. So for money that you're really relying on, like your emergency fund, like your short-term savings, those things generally I think should not be invested. And they're better suited to be placed in a savings account and something that is a lot safer. So another thing that I want to touch on is that savings accounts, like I kind of said before, they're one of the worst places for your retirement funds. Once again, differentiating between investing and savings accounts are awful because they barely keep up with inflation generally. And for your retirement, you are relying on the power of the market and high rates of return to basically compound and keep increasing in order for you to have enough money at the time of retirement. And we'll get into that sort of investing later, but one of the purposes of this podcast is to basically encourage you, if you currently have your retirement savings in a savings account, I want you to get used to moving it out of there and actually investing it. So we'll get to that in a later episode on, how the heck do you actually do that? Because I know that it's really daunting. But for right now, we'll just go back to savings accounts and, where to keep those short-term goals and where to keep those emergency funds. All right, so where to keep them. Inflation generally is around 3%. And what that means for anybody that isn't really, they don't really know what inflation is, what inflation does. It's basically the fact that your money over the years will actually lose its value. A dollar today and its buying power is not going to be the same as a dollar in 10 years and the buying power then. I mean, we hear about that all the time now. If you think back to, when our parents were little, they're like, 5 cents bought a loaf of bread and I could do all of this with a quarter and those sorts of things. So inflation is partially to blame for the fact that we can't, spend 5 cents on on a loaf of bread anymore. The buying power of $1 back then was so much greater than the buying power now. So that's essentially what inflation is. So generally speaking, it varies year to year, but for calculation purposes, people usually think of it as around 3%. It's also important to note that if you get a 3% raise year after year, you're essentially just trying to keep up with inflation. And you might not actually be technically making a whole lot more money, and a lot of that just goes to cost of living adjustments. So with inflation in mind, and especially with this emergency fund, if you keep it in a savings account that's only accruing 0.3, 0.4%, you are effectively losing buying power year after year that your money is sitting around. Now, the alternative to that is investing. And we already talked about how that's not an option. It's just too risky and it's not worth it. But there are things that we can do now to really give your emergency fund and savings a fighting chance against inflation. Because currently, some savings rates are actually pretty good right now. There are a few different options of where to put your emergency funds and savings that are in a safe place and out of the market and insured. So you have certificates of deposit, which generally you select a term, a year, 2 years, and you lock in an interest rate. Now that can be appealing because you know what the interest rate is going to be. But the crappy thing with CDs is that your money is locked up until that term is over. And if you try to take your money out before then, you're going to get hit with fees, and there's a very good chance that any fees that you have to pay are going to wipe out what you would have made anyhow. So they're technically liquid, but they're very inflexible. So that's kind of the bad thing about CDs. I know that Chris Hogan, which is one of the guys I listen to, he calls them certificates of depreciation. So he really doesn't like them for some reason. I don't have as much of a vendetta against them, but I don't think that they're necessarily the best way. Another option is a money market account. And a money market account functions very similarly to a savings account where you can actually get some higher rates on them. They're not quite as competitive as they used to be before interest rates rose. But they do have a perk to them where you can actually get a debit card or a checkbook and specifically take money out of that account directly and immediately. It is limited to 6 withdrawals a month, and that is also the same limitation that online savings accounts have. And you also have to make sure that you're looking at the fees and making sure that you're meeting any minimum deposits. Some of them can be fairly high. So it's a little bit more of an immediate account that you can get money out of. But you really have to kind of make sure that you're within the bounds and restrictions that they have. So my personal preference is a high yield online savings account. And you might think, online? What do you mean that it's online? This just doesn't sound very safe. So there are actually a lot of reputable banks and stuff that have online savings accounts, and they can offer really good percentage rates. So my recommendation right now is that if your money is not in an account that's earning at least 2%, you should really consider moving it and checking out some of the online savings accounts. So yeah, the difference between online savings accounts and a savings account at your bank or credit union is essentially they don't have the overhead of a brick and mortar building. There may be fewer people working there. They're just able to offer better rates. So there's nothing really all that magical about them other than the fact that they're offering better rates. So if your emergency fund or savings is not sitting in something that's earning at least 2%, I really want you to consider moving it. Right now, ours is in a Discover account earning 2.1%, and I know that they're very upfront with fees and all of that, and there's no minimum to get that 2.1%. A couple of things about savings accounts and online savings accounts, and that differ from the CDs. So for CDs, you actually lock in your rate. For a savings account, it fluctuates. And a lot of that is kind of dependent on the economy and other demands. Like the federal government and the Treasury, they actually will sometimes raise or lower interest rates a little bit, and that's sometimes in the news. And it can either, slow down some economic growth if it's going really quickly and they want to control it. And then sometimes it'll spur some economic growth. So just know that right now interest rates are fairly high, with it being over 2% up to about 2.5%. But it could go down a little bit. Savings accounts are still safe. They're FDIC insured generally, and you want to make sure that they are indeed FDIC insured for wherever you're putting your money, which basically means that you're not going to lose the money that you put in. And I think that that's up to $250,000. So it's an awful lot of money. So the interest rate that you're receiving might go up over a period of time, it might start to go down over a period of time, but your principal, what you've put in, should never decrease in value if you're putting it in a safe FDIC insured account. So I just want to clarify that those are the differences between an online savings account and a CD. Is a CD, you're locking in that interest rate, and a savings account, you're a little bit more, it's a little bit more volatile and just kind of depends on how the economy is doing at that time. So right now things are good, and that's why I really like the online savings accounts. So I will link to a list of different online savings accounts and the different rates associated with them. And sometimes they have stipulations. I know one requires a $25,000 minimum or a $100 automatic deposit per month. A $100 automatic deposit per month, I think, is easier for most people to achieve. The $25,000 minimum one, probably not. But you really just need to read the fine print on these accounts and pick one that's good for you. I know that a lot of people like the Ally Bank one, and they're currently at 2.2%. They're very upfront about fees, and there are very few of them. The other thing with online savings accounts is that there are certain restrictions on how many times you can withdraw from them. So I think that our Discover account, you can't make more than 6 withdrawals in a month. So that's just something to consider. Honestly, we put more money in there and just park it there, so it doesn't really matter for us. So you might be wondering, how long is it going to take me to get my money if it's in an online savings account? And the answer is probably only a day or two. It's not like you can walk down to the bank and immediately get your money in cash, but really it doesn't take that long to transfer to your bank, and you can do it automatically. I mean, that's how we make deposits. So it's really not that big of a deal. And with an emergency, you likely have some time between when the emergency happens and when you need to pay. If you're able to put it on your normal credit card that's not accruing interest and you pay it off every month, you may even have a month to pay. That's what makes most online savings accounts attractive, is the high interest rate and liquidity, even though it may take a couple of days. So with emergency funds and savings funds and where you should be putting them, taken care of, I want to more formally introduce you to Dave Ramsey. And he is a figure that is a little bit controversial in the personal finance field. He is extremely anti-debt. He actually hates credit cards, and that's one of the things I disagree with him on a little bit. But he is awesome for people that kind of need the tough love approach and just need help, making choices, and they really want a clear directive on a path to follow. So that's where I actually came up with his baby steps, and I have those linked here because baby step 1 is to establish that $1,000 emergency fund, similar to what we talked about. Baby step 2 is paying off all debt except for a mortgage. So we'll get into that a little bit in the next episode. He's kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, there's no gray area in his teachings, and I mean, it's kind of by design. He is teaching for the masses, and he has a lot of great points. Once you can kind of graduate from the first few baby steps, I think that that's when there's more option to be a little bit lenient and follow your own path. But honestly, his approach to getting out of debt and his encouragement and all of that can really, really be powerful. So I'm introducing Dave Ramsey here because of that first baby step being that $1,000 emergency fund. It's also important to note that he has a strong Christian leaning, which, you can take it or leave it, but it's just a good thing to know. And his real focus is on avoiding all debt. Like I said, he hates credit cards. Even if you pay them off every month, he just hates them because he sees all debt pretty much as a risk except for possibly a mortgage. And just to clarify, his baby step program, there's actually 7 of them. So baby step 1 is saving $1,000 in an emergency fund. Baby step 2 is paying off all debt except for any mortgages. Baby step 3 is funding that 3 to 6 month emergency fund that we talked about. And then baby step 4 is investing 15% of your gross income in retirement funds. Baby step 5 is funding children's college if that's applicable. Baby step 6 is paying off your mortgage completely. And then baby step 7 is basically living your life and enjoying the fruits of your labor. So, like I was saying, baby steps 1 through 3, 1 through 4 or so, can really be a great option for people. And his specialty is getting out of debt. And I encourage you to listen to his podcast if you're kind of one of those people that just struggles with debt and struggles with spending and you need a tough love approach and somebody that's going to say, no, that was a stupid decision. You need to get your life in control and all of that. I don't know. He's not for everybody, but what he does well, debt, you can't really argue with him. So some personal anecdotes related to our emergency fund and savings fund, that sort of thing. Back in 2015, Sam and I bought our house. And we did a lot of things right with our house. We just happened to. I did not know nearly as much as I know now, but we did a lot of things right. One of the things that I would have done differently is we did not follow baby step 3, which is saving that 3 to 6 month emergency fund, and then actually baby step 3B, as he calls it, is saving up for that down payment. We kind of just skipped that emergency fund, and Sam and I were able to come up with a 20% down payment on our house, which I'm still really proud of. But looking back now, it left us with about $2,000 in the bank, and I just can't believe that we were okay with that. I think that I was so obsessed with getting that 20% down that I didn't care with how little cash it would leave us. And really, why we put down that 20% is it's a common suggestion, and I specifically wanted to avoid the personal mortgage insurance. And if you put down at least 20%, you avoid the PMI. We'll get into that more later, but that's why we put the 20% down. And I was so proud of us for putting that 20% down. And I just kind of threw caution to the wind when it came to, having money left over. And thankfully, nothing happened. Like I said, Sam and I were fairly good savers and all of that, and nothing catastrophic happened with the house. Luckily, when we bought it, we knew that it had a new furnace, new air conditioner, and new water heaters. So, that's an awful lot of appliances that we knew were okay. We ended up actually having to put a new roof on within the year that we saved up for and paid in cash. Once again, I don't know how much we actually had left over after we paid for that roof, but we were able to do that. But looking back, I would not recommend leaving yourself that little bit of room after putting down all of the fees and the down payment for a house. That was less than a month's worth of expenses even. And we managed it, and I think that we had kind of talked with our parents, like, if the worst should happen, we could maybe borrow some money from you for a little while, right? Like, we have that safety net, which a lot of people don't, and I'm grateful that we do, and I'm grateful we didn't have to use it, but we should not have left that little bit of money after we bought the house, but now we know, and that's why I'm telling you, is so that you avoid it. Another example, and really one of the reasons that we started YNAB, is I just did not have a good sense of what our savings was for. Last summer, we were talking a little bit more seriously about buying Sam a motorcycle, and I had some idea of a budget in my head on how much we wanted to spend, but it was only after we started YNAB and I put our, small nest egg, our amount of money into YNAB and really categorized it that I figured out that we did not have money for a motorcycle at that time. And it was only after putting it in there and separating out our job loss fund and separating out our house fund and our medical deductibles and our insurance deductibles and everything else that was required that I went, we're doing fine, but we could not just willy-nilly buy a motorcycle right now. So we saved up for a few months, and we had a couple of extra paycheck months where if you're paid bi-weekly, there are 2 times a year that there are 3 Fridays in a month, and you essentially get an extra paycheck if you're essentially budgeting monthly. So we were able to buy it after a 3 paycheck month and obviously other saving and actually rating my car fund at the time when the perfect used motorcycle came along. But yeah, I was really grateful to have that clarity and knowing that we should not have bought a motorcycle at the time when I thought that we just had a whole bunch of cash and sure, we can just buy a motorcycle. I'm really glad that we didn't. So a way to split up your categories and get a better sense on what money is purposed for what is, like I said, we used different categories in YNAB, and that really gave me a lot of clarity on what our money had to do. Some people like to actually use separate bank accounts, so we did that for a little while, and we actually had a house fund in our bank account and our normal savings. It was kind of a subset, but it was kind of annoying to use. I think that we had to go to the bank to open it. I didn't really have a lot of control over it. It was a whole separate, account number. A lot of people like doing that. They have, a house fund or a car fund or a vacation fund, and they do it all within their accounts, but I just didn't really like that. And when it comes down to it, I know that with our credit union, there are different tiers for percentage rates. And so if we had smaller amounts separated into different accounts, we were getting a lower rate of interest overall than if it was sitting in one big pot and might push us to that other tier. So that's another reason that I don't really like the separate bank accounts. I should note that we still do have a bit of money in our savings account that's in our local credit union. I kind of keep going back and forth on how much we actually need in there versus putting it in the online savings account that gets so much more interest. I mean, it's amazing once you actually get a chunk of money in there and you get a good interest rate and you see the interest come in each month. It's really exciting because you're like, oh my gosh, this is actually making money. This is sort of keeping up with inflation. It's really motivating. So yeah, we still have our savings account at our credit union, and it's earning like 0.35%, so it's almost nothing. But that's where we have it right now. I might change my mind later. And you got to decide what you feel comfortable with and what works for you. So that's most of what I have to say. The videos that I have linked, Nick True touches on some awesome reasons to have emergency funds and specifically how to actually build them up. My favorite is using that extra paycheck like I was talking about, where you have an extra paycheck come in at the end of the month and just sock it away towards savings. And with emergency funds and savings accounts, it's really all about peace of mind. And you get to a point where it's up to you to decide how much you need. If your job is stable and you have some flexibility with it, you may not need that full 6 months. But if your job is really variable and you don't really know what's going to happen month to month, you might want even more than 6 months. You might want a year or something just to give you that flexibility. So there are a lot of different options, and it really is all personal. All right, so the action items that I want you to get out of this episode. Number 1, utilize your budget and figure out how to save at least $1,000 if you don't already have it and earmark it for an emergency fund. I've linked a video on Nick True's emergency fund, and he goes over a great few ways to start to fund that. Number 2, if you have a large pot of unspecified savings, start to split it up and specifically assign it to categories that the money would be used for. Examples include job loss, car fund, house fund, insurance deductibles, that sort of thing. It's a great way to figure out if you actually have enough saved, or maybe you find out that you have a whole bunch saved and you can start to invest that. Number 3, review different options for savings accounts, CDs, money markets, and my personal preference, online savings accounts. And open up an account. Begin funding it with either the savings you already have or are starting to save up. Thank you for joining me on the second episode of Financial Launchpad. Next week, we're going to be talking about debt repayment. And then after that, we will finally be getting into investing, which will be many multiple episodes, hopefully shorter, specific topics. And at the end of it, I want you to be able to open up your own account and begin investing for retirement. Thanks for joining me.